The United States isn't the only place where the boundaries between justice and politics are being tested. South Africa's president asking the Gauteng Province High Court to hold off going public with the judicial inquiry into Jacob Zuma's dealings with two Indian-born businessmen who appeared to enjoy privileged access to the highest circle of power. Did they weigh on executive decisions? Is this one scandal too many for a Jacob Zuma who so far always seems to survive? It's only Tuesday, and he's already lost one battle in the overlapping feud with his own finance minister. The National Prosecuting Authority dropping the fraud case against Pravin Gordhan. On Wednesday, the 74-year-old Zuma now faces fresh marches calling for his ouster, a steady drip of scandals, a sputtering economy, and a dogfight for power, both inside and out of the ruling ANC. It's not just the judiciary under pressure, so are state coffers and the education system, with persistent protests against university fees. In this climate of defiance, what's next after Zuma for a continental powerhouse torn between Nelson Mandela's post-apartheid Rainbow Nation legacy and the growing disillusion of impoverished blacks, tempted by more militant nationalism? Today in the France-WENTE debate, is it the end of the road for Zuma? With us from London, he's a former member of Parliament for the ANC, Andrew Feinstein. He's now the Executive Director of Corruption Watch UK, the author of After the Party, Corruption, the ANC, and South Africa's Uncertain Future. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, good to be with you.
From Johannesburg, Fahisha Hassan, Secretary General of the WITS Student Representative Council. Also joining us from London, African Affairs commentator Joseph Dankwa, the France-WENTE debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Before we go to our panel, let's go to our South Africa correspondent, Ayesha Ismail. Give us the latest, as we see, it's a busy week for Jacob Zuma, the latest on the so-called state capture report that the government doesn't want released.
Well, the state capture phrase refers to state officials becoming beholden and accountable to individuals who are close to President Jacob Zuma and who has President Jacob Zuma's ear. Now, there are multitude of examples across state-owned entities and appointment of ministers in Jacob Zuma's cabinet into strategic positions, so as to influence lucrative state tenders. And what happened was that opposition parties and civil society organizations brought this to the attention of the former public protector Thuli Madonsela and asked the public protector to investigate this, so what they termed state capture. The public protector then carried out a thorough and lengthy investigation into state capture, and namely by this very influential and politically connected Gupta family. What happened was that the public protector, then got the report done in her final days, and she was about to have this report released, but the presidency applied for an interdict asking for the report to be declared unlawful and not be made public, with President Jacob Zuma saying that he had not been given an opportunity and not given enough time to respond to the allegations against him. He also wanted to question some of the witnesses interviewed by the public protector, and unfortunately the new public protector, who is believed to be very close to President Jacob Zuma, did not oppose President Jacob Zuma's court application for this interdict. And the latest information is that opposition parties then also applied to the High Court to become part of this application because they wanted to oppose this interdict applied for by President Jacob Zuma. And today the Pretoria High Court ruled in their favor and said that the opposition parties could indeed join this application. So on Tuesday, tomorrow, this application brought by President Jacob Zuma and opposed by the opposition parties will be heard. It was very, very important for the opposition parties to join this court application because the fear was that this public protector's final report into state capture may not have seen the light of day had the opposition parties not been able to join in this application. The fear was that this report would have just been shoved somewhere and perhaps just gathered dust.
All right. At the heart of it all is, it seems, this family of Indian-born businessmen, the Guptas, who are involved in everything from computers to mining. One case in particular drawing a lot of attention. Back in 2013, a family plane carrying wedding guests to the nearby Sun City Resort landed at the Waterkloof Air Base near Pretoria, the base normally reserved for visiting heads of state and diplomatic delegations. They even got a police motorcade at the time, something that drew attention. Let me ask you, stay with us, Aisha, because I want to put this to Andrew Feinstein. Andrew, just how much influence do the Guptas have in South Africa today?
Well, I think they have enormous influence. I think that the president is, as your report suggests, completely captured by the Guptas. What we don't know is the extent of the financial relationship and arrangements between the Guptas and President Zuma. But you've got to bear in mind, this is a president who came to office having just very controversially had 783 counts of fraud, corruption, and racketeering in relation to bribes paid to him. These were very controversially dropped just before he was elected president by an acting prosecutor who, after the election, was then made an acting high court judge. So none of this should come as a huge surprise. I think the reality of the situation, though, is during his time in office, he has become more and more beholden to financial interests, including the Guptas. And perhaps the zenith of their influence over him was shown when a few months ago he decided to fire his quite well-respected finance minister, who wasn't doing his bidding in what were perceived to be quite problematic, possibly even corrupt deals that the president wanted to enter into. He fired this finance minister, and it appeared as though the Guptas appointed his successor, who was a person unknown even to ANC MPs in Parliament, who'd had some very small office in some local government very briefly, from which he'd actually left in disgrace. And it was the Guptas who informed this gentleman that he was going to be the next finance minister. It was the Guptas who provided him with his two advisors. And I think that moment perhaps showed the full extent of the Guptas' influence over President Zuma.
You've been a long-standing member of the ANC, Andrew. Does this surprise you from Jacob Zuma? Is this the same Jacob Zuma you've always known?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, unfortunately, that what started happening even under Nelson Mandela's first successor, Thabo Mbeki, was that the boundaries between state and party became incredibly fuzzy. And in a notorious arms deal in which the South African state decided to spend $10 billion on weapons that they neither needed nor have really used before, in which we've calculated around $300 million of bribes were paid, Mbeki, Zuma's predecessor, really used the organs of the state to protect people close to him politically from any meaningful investigation. Zuma, who took over from Mbeki, who actually deposed him within the ANC, has taken all of this a number of steps further. And sadly, it's not a surprise. I mean, the man I had known for the years that I was in government, who I worked with on a number of issues, was somebody who would say to whatever audience he was speaking to exactly what they wanted to hear, regardless of what his own views were on the matter. He had headed ANC intelligence in exile. So he had a lot of information about pretty much everybody within the ANC, and he used that information in incredibly devious ways. His modus operandi in politics was one of working in the shadows, some would argue working in the gutters. He had this very tough side to him. He would do whatever was needed to protect himself. And unfortunately, that's been reflected in the nature of his presidency since he's been in the office.
All right, it's resulting now in this standoff, if you will, that's taking place in the courts on several levels, as we've just heard, and several characters are important. One of them, for that state capture report that Ayesha was mentioning, was prepared by South Africa's now former public protector, Thuli Madonsela, whose term expired, as she mentioned, 2 weeks ago. This is a cartoon by Rico Sharshall for Finweek, and it shows her taking on Jacob Zuma, and it can seem a bit like a daunting task. It looks like it's called Whack-a-Zuma instead of Whack-a-Mole in the cartoon. Ayesha, tell me a little bit about her, Thuli Madonsela.
Well, Thuli Madonsela was respected in South Africa across the political spectrum. When civil society organizations and opposition parties brought this matter of state capture to her attention, as I said earlier, she did a thorough report. People were waiting for this report to be released. They put their faith into Thuli Madonsela. She's done a number of investigations, and as I said, she was very, very respected by people across the political spectrum. What has now happened is that we have a new public protector who is seen and perceived to be close to Jacob Zuma, and she did not oppose Jacob Zuma's application for Thuli Madonsela's report to be made public. The question is, though, and this is the question asked by ordinary people as well as by opposition parties and people in the legal fraternity, if President Jacob Zuma has nothing to hide, why does he not want this report to be made public?
All right, thanks for that, and I want to thank you, Ayesha Ismail, for laying the picture, painting the picture for us from South Africa. Let me ask Fasia San. We're going to talk later, of course, about the student protests that you're involved in, but first, when you see the tug of war happening in the system, when you see the appointments that are made to the judiciary, do you have faith in the system in South Africa and South Africa's institutions?
I think as young people, there's a lot of disillusioned members of society. I think that the more we see corruption, the more we see a failing democracy in many ways, not just the more angry students become, but I think the more concerned. And the more we feel the need for us to enter into these spaces and for us to really take on a leadership role. And I think that was never meant to be the role of such young people. You know, ours is just to learn, to gain skills, to then only go into government. But I think that the current system and the current leaders have become so problematic that there's a need for us to, in fact, cleanse the system much earlier than we thought.
Cleanse the system how?
One of the biggest things I think we've realized over the last year is the fact that if we as young people don't take charge and don't take leadership on issues, it's not going to happen. And I think it's been illustrated again that unless we are the ones who push for something to happen, whether it's for education, whether it's national health insurance, whether it's a minimum wage, whatever it may be, if we're not as South African...
We seem to have lost the connection there. We'll try to reconnect that with Fasia San in Johannesburg. Joseph Dankwa, let me ask you, you're Ghanaian. South Africa always seen on the continent as a model when you look at its institutions. What's your reaction to everything you've just heard?
My reaction is one of great disappointment. The euphoria of 1994 has now gone down the drain. The euphoria of the rainbow nation, the euphoria of a new African nation, giving the continent a new, a new look, a new perception, and a new drive. And after 22 years of the liberation struggle coming to an end, what we see now is the same old story of a newly independent African state going the way of the former. That is corruption and nepotism, and it's a big disappointment because we always had seen South Africa as the continent which could project us internationally. They were the first African nation to host a World Cup. There were even plans for them to take on the Olympic Games further on and other major international sporting events. And if you look at the governance going on in South Africa now, it's no better than what's happening in the rest of the continent. And for me, it's a big disappointment, and it's a far cry from what we expected.
Nonetheless, we see that there is blowback. We see opposition parties do gain ground. We see a thriving press in South Africa. There are checks and balances that you don't see in many other African nations. Yes,
it's true, because one thing South Africa has is that it has strong institutions which have, even though they were there during the apartheid era, have been able to stand the changes during the post-apartheid era, and those institutions have been able to stand the test of time. For me, looking at it, that is the thing which would save South Africa from going into a full-blown state of chaos and total corruption. That these institutions were able to stand against whoever is trying to abuse the system. For instance, you can find the sitting presently, Jacob Zuma, being taken to court. He was even taken to court as vice president some years back. So you can see that the system does work in South Africa. But for me, it's about the image being projected now. It's about the image of the African leader able to rule without being tainted with scandal. The African leader able to rule without being tainted with, nepotism. These are the things we should look at. Yes, the institutions are there. They'll protect the citizenry. But then what sort of leader are we producing as an African? That is what we should ask ourselves.
All right, when we come back, we're going to take a look at the broader picture and whether or not, indeed, Jacob Zuma is close to being ousted or whether he still has fight in him. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.